Good evening. Welcome to this special time of learning and listening and hopefully understanding. I trust you can all hear, or maybe, can you? Good. All right. Well, as most of you know, probably, I don't usually have that kind of an echo. Is it something should be worked on? Or do you not hear an echo? No, you don't. Okay. All right. Well, this evening, we are going to look at a story in the books of Matthew and Mark about a lady. Unfortunately, we don't know her name. She's called the Syrophoenician woman. And it seems typical of a number of people, particularly ladies, in the Gospels, in the New Testament, who are not really named. They're just women, and some men. But in this particular case, we do not have a name. Now, the story is taken from two Gospels, Matthew chapter 15 and Mark chapter 7. Now, it seems that when I was much younger and we had Sunday school class, we always had to go around reading the verses. Sometimes we read one by one by one by one, but I didn't plan for that. So tonight I'm going to read Matthew 15, verses 21 to 28. I'm not certain that this is what's in your Sunday school book. I mean, your book probably has the story from Mark. Yes, I'll read that next or later. So the Matthew story says, coming out from there, Capernaum, Jesus left for the regions of Tyre and Sidon. And a Canaanite woman from that area came, crying out to him, saying, "Have mercy on me, Lord, Son of David. My daughter is badly demon-tormented." But he did not answer her with a word. And his disciples came to him and asked him, "Send her away. She keeps hollering after us." He answered, "I was only sent to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." But she came and worshipped him, saying, "Lord, help me." And he answered, "It is not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." And she said, "Yes, Lord. But the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table." And then Jesus answered her, "Woman, your trust is great. It will be for you as you wish." And her daughter was healed from that hour. And then from Mark, chapter 7. Going up from there, they came into the shores of Tyre. And when he entered a house, he didn't want anyone to know, but he was unable to hide. Immediately, a woman heard about him who had a daughter with an unclean spirit. She came and fell at his feet. The woman was Greek, a Syrophoenician by birth. She begged him to cast out the demon from her daughter. He said to her, "First, let the children have plenty to eat, for it isn't right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." But she answered, "Lord, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." And he said to her, "Because of this statement, go. The demon has gone out of your daughter." And when she went home, she found her child lying on the bed, and the demon had gone. Two stories, rather, one story. written by two different writers, each with somewhat of a different intent of who they were writing to, but the same general story. Now, a bit of background of what went before the stories. Jesus was in Capernaum, and he had been very busy. He had fed the 5,000 people. That is a big job, you know, feeding 5,000. I'm sure it is, especially when you had to do the multiplying like he did. And then he was besieged by the Pharisees and the Sadducees, who wanted to argue with him about the law and about what is clean and what is unclean. I thought it was rather interesting that their complaint was not so much what people were eating. It was about the fact that they had not washed their hands first. It kind of sounds like a mother. You know, you mothers, those of you who are mothers, probably went through this many times. Did you wash your hands? Did you wash your hands? And so these Pharisees and Sadducees are quite concerned that Jesus' disciples had not washed their hands. And I could say, well, there was no mother there. At least we're not told that there was or wasn't. But in any case, they didn't wash their hands. And of course, that led into this discussion about what is clean, what is unclean, what can you eat, what can you not eat, and so on. A very special kind of concern for these Pharisees and Sadducees who had dedicated their lives to following the law carefully, very carefully, and very exactly. And I grew up kind of thinking that the Pharisees were the bad guys. And yet, I do think we need to give them credit for their dedication, their intent to do what is right. Unfortunately, perhaps we could say, they carried it to extremes and got overwhelmed with it. And then we have this story of the encounter with this lady, and I'll talk about her when I finish this other introduction. After the encounter with the lady, in Mark, we are told that Jesus and his disciples met a man who was deaf and who didn't talk, and he was healed. And then the next story in both Gospels is that he fed 4,000 people. And I suppose that was easier than the previous one. 5,000, we know how to do it. This time we only did 4,000. And after that, he healed a man who was paralyzed. So there was a long continuum of Jesus doing wonderful things for people and helping them in their various kinds of difficulties and distresses. So Jesus was in the Jewish territory. He was in Capernaum. He was tired, and he decided that he needs to get away somewhere and rest. And so he went to Tyre. And the historical record tells us that Tyre was a center of anti-Jewish activity. So it seems a bit strange, perhaps, that he would go to a place so extreme. But there may have been an undercurrent of intent there, because being in Jewish country, being with Jewish people, and they knowing his gifts of healing and of listening and of helping, they came to him. And it may be, perhaps, that he thought, or at least maybe the disciples suggested it, and maybe they thought, let's go someplace where you're not so well known, or someplace where the paparazzi, someplace where they won't bother you so much. You can go aside there. We'll find a nice house, a good cook, a place to stay, and we can have some rest and recover from the tensions and the stresses that were around him at the previous time. Well, who shows up? The Sadducees and the Pharisees. They found him. They went into this pagan territory and found him. And, of course, they immediately began a program of criticizing and harassing and causing havoc for him. Can't get away from them. I just finished a biography of Prince Harry of England, and all through the book, if any of you read it, page after page, how the photographers harassed them, to the point of his mother, of course, having the difficulties in Italy when she was actually killed, and on totally after them. Well, anyway, as we've generally thought typical, the Pharisees and the Sadducees came there and began causing him some trouble. Well, now, I don't know that it was planned. I know that, well, I'm quite sure the disciples didn't see this as a turning point for Jesus, moving from Jewish country and Jewish ministry to Gentile country and Gentile ministry. There was no such thing as Gentile ministry. Jesus came for the children of Israel, the sheep of Israel. He didn't come to take care of the Gentiles. I mean, we'll get into that a bit later. I don't think anybody perceived that walking 20 miles from Capernaum to Tyre would cross a magical line somewhere and would open the life of Jesus to a dramatic change in focus, to being not just for the Jews, but also for us, also for the Gentiles. And there they are. They're arriving in Tyre. And this woman begins calling out to them, "Lord, help me, help me, help me." In Matthew, "Help me." And the disciples said, "Oh, no." And they went to her and they, shush. They shushed her up. Away from her. He's tired. He needs to rest. He needs to take some time away. It takes energy. It takes emotional thought. It takes spiritual stamina and reserve to do the things that Jesus is doing. Don't bother him. And they didn't say this, but they probably were thinking, you're just a Gentile anyway. You're just a Gentile. She said, "My daughter has demon possession of some kind." And somehow, this lady knew that Jesus could help her, that Jesus could relieve her tension, her frustration, her concern for her daughter. The disciples wanted to protect him from this heathen woman, but Jesus doesn't accept the protection. Jesus is always ready to turn and answer, even when he's too tired. I thought about this. I wonder how often I've been too tired to do something good. Perhaps too often. Unfortunately, don't you think it's sad? We don't know her name. We don't know her name. Poor thing. All we know is that she's a lady who was born in Syrophoenicia. And of course, approaching Jesus, a Jew, was bad news for three reasons, at least three. She was a woman. Women don't do this. She was a Gentile. She had no business going after Jesus. And she was a foreigner. It brings back some remembrances, some ideas of other occasions where Jesus encountered this kind of situation. We call her the woman at the well that Jesus talked with. She was also a Gentile. And she was a woman, and remember, Jesus talked to her, and she said, "What? You, a Jew, talk to a foreign woman? What's with you? What kind of person are you?" But this mother knew what went on in her home. We don't know for how long. We don't know for how many years. But it was her thought. It was her intent in her heart to find hope, to find healing for her daughter. I'm sure that many of us, most of us, remember or have experience with a child who needs help, or if not our own child, someone close to us, someone who needs help. I look back and remember when I was 6 years old. I won't tell a long story, but when I was 6 years old, my older brother, who was 10, began having epileptic seizures. And I remember how, I don't know if I would say desperate, but my parents tried everything that was available and some things that weren't, to find help for him. I remember going to Baltimore to Johns Hopkins University Hospital for help. And as we went, my parents said, "Now watch. As we're driving through Baltimore, you might see a black person." I had never seen a black person. There was nobody like that where I lived, believe it or not. We were a white ghetto, 40 miles north of Baltimore. And I remember I saw a black person. No help at Johns Hopkins, the best place in the world, at least in the East at that time. They went to the doctor, this doctor, they went to I don't know how many, and they even went to the powwow doctor. I don't know what you think about powwowing. I don't know what to think. But they even went to the powwow doctor. I remember that because I went along. I sat here and he sat here and the powwow doctor did his whatever or whatever. I don't know what he did. Now I wish I knew what he did. A parental care to do even the edge, even that which may not be to us thinking now, to use the German or the Jewish term, may not be kosher. But this was not something new for Jesus, this activity. He had been involved, as you know, all along. All these months, all these years, he had been involved. And at first he's silent. He doesn't respond to the woman. But the lady keeps after it. She keeps after him. She says, "If you just say a word, my daughter will be healed." I've wondered about how did she know this? How had his reputation spread from Jewish closed society to this heathen enclave up along the coast of what is today, it would be Syria, Lebanon, a little bit of Turkey. How did she know? But word spreads, good word spreads. And so, in a sense, she pushed him to face his true calling. And Jesus responds. He says, "Woman, it's not a good idea to take the bread on the table and give it to the dogs." According to these people called commentaries, of the people who write them rather, they say it was not uncommon for Jewish households to have a little dog. And they make it a point of saying that the Greek specifically says a little dog that maybe sat under the table with his tail bumping your foot, waiting and waiting for those few crumbs. And if you were a child, you might have sent one under there. I know that has happened. Or maybe if there was something you didn't like and you snuck it up under the table on the board, thinking nobody will know, the dog maybe got it. I'm told that happens too. I didn't do that. I'm not sure what I did with what I didn't like. But Jesus says, it would be unthinkable to give the bread to the dogs. Interesting, through so many of Jesus' stories, so much of his life, he talks about bread. He talks about himself. He talks about bread. And here he's talking about bread. And he says, you wouldn't do this. And for sure, if you had bread that was extra, you wouldn't give it to the dogs. And it seems that the dog, I'm going to read some verses here, where Scripture uses the picture of a dog of being just a pretty low character. And I've never thought of a dog as being all that bad. I wasn't going to tell this, but now I'm going to. This week, at our house, in a trap, they caught a skunk on Tuesday. And on Wednesday, they caught another one. And this morning, they had an opossum. And I would think of all three of those. Oh, don't worry, they're gone. I don't know where they took them, someplace beyond Oregon Dairy. I don't know where that is. So you don't need to worry about those. But the dogs is what they used as a metaphor here. The worst of people, and it was an unclean animal. And I wonder if that has any connection to the fact that Jesus had just had these discussions with the Pharisees about that which is clean, that which is unclean. And here he's saying, you don't give your bread to the unclean dog. Let me tell you some verses. Actually, in Matthew, I'm not sure which translation it says, we don't cast our pearls before swine, and neither do we take that which is holy and give it to the dogs. I remember at EMC, one of the professors apparently wasn't too pleased with our class. And he told us one day, when I come into class, I feel like I'm throwing my pearls to the swine. How are we to feel? We laughed. It was, yeah. So he says, the children of Israel eat first, and that my ministry is to the children, not meaning these little people. Matthew 15, he also says, I was not sent except to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Now, of course, I wouldn't imagine giving bread to sheep, so I don't know quite how that fits together. But it's interesting that this verse that I just read is the only time in the Gospels when Jesus is the one who says, I was sent to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Others said it, but this is the only time he said it. And I think it's interesting that he says it when he's standing on the edge of offering his pearls to the swine, so to speak, to the dogs. He's standing at that edge of change of ministry from the Jew to the Gentile. Matthew 10 says, well, yes, when Jesus was talking to his disciples at one point, he told them, do not go away into the land of the Gentiles, and do not go to the city of the Samaritans, but go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. He's telling his disciples. He doesn't say, I do this. He's telling them, you do it. And, of course, they did. Psalm 22:16, probably David says, in the middle of difficulties, dogs have surrounded me. Evil men have circled me around. And then it is a interesting additional note here. Revelation chapter 22, verse 15, describing that holy city, he says, outside the city are dogs. Those who do magic, those who are immoral, murderers, idolaters, and liars. And that's the description that he gives for that eternal home of ours. Now, one of the commentaries I read said, this is proof. This statement that Jesus made that he's not going to help this woman because she's not a Jew, she does not deserve the bread that he has to give, is proof that Jesus was just a little less than kind. He was rude. He was nasty. People have their opinions. I think I read 12 commentaries about this, and I decided that one didn't know what he was talking about. I believe that Jesus was not being rude in this statement. He was simply acknowledging to her that she knew, she understood that he was called to the Jew and not to her, and so in a sense, he was saying to her, you need to honor my calling. I was called to the Jew. I was called to give the bread to the Jew, to the children of Israel. And you are asking the wrong person for healing for your daughter. If you want healing for your daughter, there must be some people in your culture who can help you. But don't come to me, because my healing, my medicine, is for my people. I don't know if that was part of the mind or not. But I believe that the woman had a sense that Jesus would help her. I think being bold and coming to him in this way, she did not assume that he would push her off, but she assumed that he would honor her request because he had a long history of doing this. She doesn't ask to sit at the table and eat the bread. She could have. She simply says, when he answers, yes, Lord, I know about your calling. I know about the bread on the table, but I also know about the crumbs. And I know I don't qualify, but neither does the dog sit at the table to eat. At least most cases the dog doesn't. The dog doesn't sit at the table to eat. The dog eats the crumbs And all I need is a crumb. All I need. I don't need a loaf of bread. I don't need a whole piece. I don't need butter and jelly or whatever you want to put on the bread. I don't know what they put on their bread. Maybe fig jam. Maybe fig jam. All I need is to scavenge some of the crumbs that are under the table. And I suppose perhaps Jesus shook his head and said, "This is the kind of faith that builds my kingdom." And he said in Matthew, he said, "Your word is what has effected the healing." Your word, not his. I was amazed. He didn't say, "Oh, Spirit, come down on this child." He didn't go to her house and put his hands on her. He did that sometimes. Or in the case of Jairus' daughter, he said, "Go, your daughter will be healed." He says in Matthew that it was the word of the mother that brought the healing. Not that the power was in her, but it was her faith. And I really thought about this. I sat on my sofa and pondered it and wondered, what is the calling of us? Can we, do we, shall we say the word to bring healing, to bring restoration? I think so. We are a part of it. We are a part of bringing this healing to those who are hurting. You might remember the centurion who came to Jesus, and Jesus said, "Well, I'm not able to do this right now, and I'm a man. I'm a man under command. I'm a heathen." He didn't say heathen, but that's what he was. And you're Jesus, or was it Paul? I forget. I'm getting this story mixed up. And they said, "Just say the word here, and it will happen there." Isn't that pretty? Isn't that beautiful? We can trust that. The faith, then, was in Jesus' ability to bring healing. Jesus didn't say to the lady, "Well, you don't even deserve the crumbs." He honored her request. He honored her request to give her, in a sense, the crumbs. Remember, talk a little more about crumbs. Remember the feeding of the 4,000, which had just happened the day or so before, and they had 7 baskets of leftovers. Crumbs, it says, 7 baskets of crumbs. And then one of the next stories, they feed 5,000, or I have it backwards. No, let me see. First was 5, I guess, and then was 4. If I could, which one was first? First was the 5, and they had 12 baskets, and then they were 4, and they had 7 baskets. That's a lot of crumbs. That's a lot of crumbs. That would heal a lot of people. Yeah. And so this pagan woman pushed Jesus to move a step into his next kind of ministry, to move him to acknowledge that his healing touch was needed for all people, not just the Jew. Being a bread of life was bread for all people. I'm reminded of the Good Samaritan, where it was the outcast, the Samaritan, who did what the good Jewish people didn't do. Here we have the heathen woman pushing Jesus to do what is necessary. I said, she didn't ask to sit at the table. She only wanted the crumbs. But there's going to be a time when we call it the Feast of the Lamb of God in heaven. I don't think there's going to be just crumbs on that table. There's going to be whole loaves of something. And I'm not sure that there's going to be crumbs under the table, and I don't expect to find dogs under the table. But we can look forward to that time. Jesus healed people through the faith of other people, like the mother. I'm wondering, can we do this? Should we do this? Should we not do this? Now, I thought, I'm told that preachers are supposed to have 3 parts in their sermons. You have the introduction, and you have the main part, and you have the summary. And the important thing is to get 1 and 2 as close together as possible. I wondered, what do we take from this? And so I went back to my computer when it was working, and I looked up and I thought, 8 points from the story. Good, that's a lot. Another one said 5 points. Another one said 4 points. So I thought, I wonder how far I'll go till I get no points. Well, I didn't go that far. But here are some things that were suggested from those points, saying, it is a story of spiritual insight on the part of a person whom we didn't or wouldn't anticipate would have spiritual insight, the mother. And it is a story of connection between faith and difficulty. Somehow, when we encounter difficulties, we go toward faith. We don't need faith so much when things are going smooth. But when there's difficulty, sometimes we latch on to it. It's a connection between faith and helping other people. A connection between faith and depending on God. Faith and persistence. It's like the story of the man who came said he was needed bread for somebody, and the man of the house said, "Go away, I'm in bed with my children." And I used to think, what? In bed with your children? But I saw that, numbers of times when I was in Moldova. The whole family slept in one bed. Well, the house wasn't very big, but the whole family slept in one bed. And the summary of it all was, when there is great faith, there is great result. When there is great faith, there's great result. And we think about all the people who were touched in the story. It wasn't just the woman and her child. It was their neighbors, I'm sure. And what about the disciples? Did they learn anything from all this? I hope so. I hope so. And their community. But then, finally, what have we learned? What do we learn from this story? We have many opportunities to not push aside the person in need and to turn them to Jesus. In many ways, the story is like the race issue that we've had for used for centuries, I guess, in our country, between the black and white. And so, again, how late am I supposed to go? Great faith results in great results. Thank you. Is that